Would you please put your hands together, make a ton of noise, and celebrate Miss Gina Butts as she comes to the stage. Thanks, Gina.
All right, so how many people called their moms this morning already? Oh, I'm winning. I called my mom. It was mostly because I knew if I didn't do it in the morning, I would forget. And my mom's up super early, so it's easy to call her. Even though she's in Minnesota, she's an hour ahead. I wish I was up in Minnesota today, actually, because this is a beautiful time of year to be there. And my dad is an amazing gardener. So he has these beautiful, beautiful gardens in his backyard. And this is the time of year when everything is starting to grow. And he always plants tulips, in particular because he knows that I love them. Even though I don't get to see them, he'll send me pictures of them. I really wish that I had inherited this green thumb from my dad. I did not. I don't even have a lot of hope for that succulent when I take it home today. But every once in a while I get this idea that I am going to grow something. A couple years ago, I noticed that a friend of mine had a mint plant in her front walk. And I thought, ooh, I should grow mint. Because I had this feeling like if I grew a mint plant, I would cook things with it, which is funny because I hate cooking, but it felt like I would be inspired and I would add mint to lots of things. So I bought a mint plant and I put it on my front walk because that's where my friend had hers. And then I promptly forgot about it. And so every once in a while I'd open my front door and I'd see my mint plant and I'd be like, I feel like it doesn't look as good as it used to. And then I'd shut my door and do nothing about it. And over time, it just got worse and worse. And at some point I thought, this thing is gonna die completely if I don't do something about it. So I went online and did what I should have done in the first place, which was to Google, what do mint plants need to survive? And it was everything I wasn't giving it. Like, it needs morning sun, and it was like on the west side of our house. And it needs water, surprisingly, on a regular basis. And it needs food and things like that. So I thought, okay, I gotta bring this thing back to life. And at the same time, I was reading a book called Soul Keeping by John Ortberg. And this book is just about what it takes for our souls to do well. And I was very convicted by that book that I was not taking care of my soul. I wasn't thinking about what it needs to do well, to survive. What does it need to be fed? What kind of environment does it need? And so I put my mint plant on my back porch where when I sit and I have my time with God in the morning, I could see it, so I would remember it. And I cut it down to, like, at this point, the black nubs that were left. I set an app on my phone to remind myself to water it every few days. I put food on it. And then I was like, okay, little mint plant, you have to come back to life because at this point I feel like you are a metaphor for my soul. And sure enough, a few weeks later, this is what I saw. And I danced around on my porch like a mad scientist. Like, I was like, it's alive! I was so excited. And it came back to life and it thrived. And I think I probably only ever used the leaves to, like, put it in water. I didn't actually use it for cooking. And then I realized after a while I didn't want to go through the effort of keeping it alive because I never did anything with it. But the process of watching this plant grow reminded me of a verse from Deuteronomy 4:9. It says, only take care and keep your soul diligently. And that verse, take care, be diligent with your soul. That word diligent means to be intentional. It means that soul care doesn't just happen by accident. It's something we have to choose to do. Our souls are the deepest part of us, the part of us that's made in the image of God. It's meant to be deeply connected to Him and thriving in the power of His Holy Spirit. God deeply loves your soul, and He wants it to thrive. He wants it to be doing well. So that begs the question, what do our souls really need? And I think first and foremost, they need rest. Now, if you are a mom today, you easily have many reasons why you are weary, right? You can say, Mom, I have 1, 2, 3, however many reasons to be weary. But the fact is, we're all weary for different reasons. We might be weary in our souls because we're just way too busy. We're doing way more than we should be doing. We're expecting way too much of ourselves. Our souls become like the soil that Jesus talked about, that's choked by weeds of shoulds and oughts and pressure and lies and obligations. If you're a mom, you know the feeling of when all of your kids want something at the same time and they're all kind of clamoring for your attention and it all just feels like too much. But even if you're not a mom, you know what it feels like when everything in your life, all of your responsibilities, all of your obligations are clamoring for your attention and it's just too much. So how do we find a restful pace? How do we find rest in the midst of all of that clamoring? We are weary, and yet we resist rest. I often feel like I can treat rest like I'm on a racetrack, and I'm going, and rest is just that pit stop for when I have to. Like, I can't keep going, and I just got to pull over, and let's switch out the tires really fast and gas it up. And how quickly can we do this? What's the smallest amount of time that I can take away to get back onto that racetrack and keep going? Friends, that is not rest. That's just a pit stop. And God asks us to rest. He invites us to it. I want to focus on some verses today from Matthew 11:28-30. And you've probably heard this, but maybe not in this version. This is the Message version of it. Jesus says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll live freely, learn to live freely and lightly." In these verses, Jesus speaks to the situations that we live in. Sometimes we're physically tired and we need rest. Sometimes it's this that we're worn thin mentally or emotionally from the things that we've been doing. Or as Colin's been talking about the last few weeks, we're burned out trying to live a religion that isn't really faith. It's not really what God has called us to, and it wears us down. And Jesus extends this invitation to us. Take a real rest. A real rest. I'm going to unpack what that looks like today and in the next few weeks. But I want to take a step back and I want to look at the first invitation that God gives us to rest. And it's found in Deuteronomy 5:12-15. "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who's within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." Now, this idea of Sabbath as a command, sometimes it's easy to look at that and think, well, that's the Old Testament, right? We don't live by that anymore. But God commands us to rest, and we see that Jesus himself observed the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is a command, but it's also an invitation to something that we desperately need. And I think that's what God gives it to us. But why? Why is it so important? Why does God ask us to rest? You notice verse 15, it seems a little out of place. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Why? What does that have to do with Sabbath? Well, I think it means that we rest because we're free. We rest because we will not be slaves. We will not be slaves to technology, to our jobs, to what the world says that we should do, to children, to soccer practice, to whatever it is that demands our time. We have to fight to rest, to remind ourselves that we are free. Mark Buchanan, in his book, The Rest of God, which if you want to do something as we're going through this series, I would encourage you to read this book. He said, "God made us from dust. We're never too far from our origins. The Apostle Paul says we're only clay pots, dust mixed with fire mixed with water, passed through fire. Hard, yes, but brittle too. Knowing this, God gave us the gift of Sabbath. Not just a day, but as an orientation, a way of seeing and knowing. Sabbath keeping is a form of mending. It's mortar in the joints. Keep Sabbath, or else break too easily and over soon. Keep it, otherwise our dustiness consumes us, becomes us, and we end up able to hold exactly nothing. It is both a day and an attitude. It's a day and an attitude. And if you're a mom out there, this might be making you feel like under the pile, like, Gina, I do not have a day. I do not have a day to rest. Every single day I have to work. I have to take care of my kids. But rest is both a day and an attitude. And we're going to unpack what that means today. But first we need to address what keeps us from rest. And it's not just about, I don't have time. Rest requires two things of us. First, rest requires humility. Humility is seeing ourselves rightly. It's recognizing our humanity. To admit where we let pride keep us from resting. Paul Reinhardt, in her book, Strong Women, Soft Hearts, said, none of us can do the superwoman thing all that long before the edges start to fray. Our humanity bleeds through. And I would say that's true not only for women, but for everyone. None of us can do the superhuman thing all that long before the edges start to fray. We need to admit where we have taken on too much, where we have taken on things God has not actually called us to do, where we are believing the myth of our own indispensability and our own invincibility. And that is so hard to do because it usually means pulling back, saying no, taking back yeses, asking others to step in and help us to take our responsibilities for a time. That requires humility. It leaves us wondering what other people will think. Is this going to invite chaos if I just let everything go? Last fall, I came to a point where I knew I was doing too much. And I hated the idea of letting go of something because it meant that I couldn't do it all, that I wasn't as great as I thought I was, that I have limits, which I hate to admit, and that people might be disappointed, that they might see that I am not as great as they thought I was. But I knew that stepping back was an act of humility, to realize I cannot do all this and I need rest. To admit that I am human, and it's okay to just be human. There's a phrase we often use, I'm just in a busy season, right? It's just a busy season. I'll rest when the season's over. My husband and I used to be really good at saying that. We're just in a busy season. But what we realized at some point was we just went from one busy season to the next busy season to the next busy season. We lived in Singapore for 5 years, and if you don't know, Singapore is on the equator. It essentially has no seasons. And so you just have a climate is what you have. You have a busy climate. That's not a season anymore, okay? We need to admit where we have a busy climate in our lives. The other thing that we love to say is, I just love what I do. It doesn't feel like work, right? So then I don't have to rest from it. Everything that I was doing last fall was something that I loved. It was something that was in many ways life-giving, and yet it was still too much. To acknowledge that is humility. We cannot wait until the work is done to rest. It will never be done. We rest in the midst of it because we are humble enough to admit that we need it. But to rest in the midst of busyness also requires us to trust. Trust that the world doesn't need us for a time, that God doesn't need us for a time. The world already has a Savior. It will keep going without us, right? We need to trust that others can take care of things while we stand on the sidelines, that God knows how much is good for us, and He would not call us to do more than what is good for us to do. So we have a dog named Scout. She's arguably the cutest dog in the world. A few years ago, she got really sick, and she had to be on steroids that gave her insane energy. So much so that it wasn't enough to walk her anymore. We had to bike her. And even then, she would take off out of the driveway like her tail was on fire. Like, just straight up. You don't even have to pedal. You just let her pull you. And I would look at this and think, how is this comfortable for you? Like, she's pulling me by her neck, right? And the thing is, I knew we were going to take this 3-mile loop every time. And by the end, she'd be dragging behind me because she let it all out the first mile. And I thought, I wish that I could tell you how far we're gonna go. And that I know the pace that you can keep. And if you would just stay in step with me, this would be so much more enjoyable for you. And I thought, that's exactly what I do with God. I wanna go at this pace, this breakneck pace in my life. I wanna get lots of things done and do lots of things. And God says, Gina, I know how far we're going. And I know the pace that we can keep. And so you have to trust me when I tell you that it's time to slow down. You have to trust that if I'm not asking you to do something, you don't have to do it. That's the kind of trust that we need in order to enter rest. So what does rest look like? Well, the first thing is that we rest in space. I said it's a day and an attitude. Another way of saying that is space and grace. We're going to talk about space. Jesus invites us to take this real rest. And the way that Mark Buchanan puts it in his book that I love is he says that we rest from that which is required, and we do that which restores. We rest from that which is required, and we do that which restores. So we stop doing the things that drain us for a time. We need times when we set the tasks aside, even when they're not done. Now that our kids are older and they can take care of themselves, I try to keep Sunday as a day of Sabbath. And it's a day when I don't do things that I don't want to do. And so I don't cook on Sundays, and my family knows this. That is something I do not enjoy, as I made clear earlier. So when it comes to dinner time, there's the refrigerator. Help yourself. I make the choice not to do that. So what is it that drains you? Don't do the laundry on Sabbath. Don't mow the lawn. Don't send one more email, one more phone call. Do those. Step aside from those things that drain the life out of you for a time so that you can be restored. And then to do that which restores. I think there used to be this idea of Sabbath. In fact, I know there was a practice of Sabbath where you couldn't do anything. Like you just had to sit there, and like everybody's just sitting, and it wasn't any fun. And that's not what God's calling us to. The point of Sabbath is that we are restored, and there are things that we can do that restore our souls. My husband and I often on a Sunday will do a DIY project together. We love to make things together. We've made furniture and wall hangings and things, and that's really fun for us. It's something that gives us life. I take pictures, I read. I don't know what restores you, but it's good to know what it is. What is it that would restore you in a time of rest? In this country, I think that we're really good at leisure. Leisure isn't always rest. If you've ever taken small children to Disney World, you know that that's true. Anytime you take kids anywhere, it doesn't end up being the most restorative thing that you could do. Leisure is fine. Leisure is good. It is recreation, right? The word recreation has the word recreate. We're trying to recreate something in us. But we need to be sure that we actually do leisure that restores our souls. Of course, God is one who restores our souls. And so if our rest doesn't at times include him, then I don't know that we can really fully be restored. We need to invite God into our times of rest because nothing restores our soul like he does. So I don't know what a Sabbath, what a space, a time would look like for you. Maybe it is a day. Maybe it is something that you can say, I'm going to set this day aside each week, and I'm going to stop what drains me, and I'm going to do what restores me. Maybe if you have young children, it's more of, okay, I'm going to take the morning, you're going to take the afternoon, right? Maybe it's an hour here or there, but we need to be intentional about time that we will protect fiercely and say, I will rest in this time. I will not do the things that drain me. I will allow the Lord to restore me in this Space doesn't even always have to mean big chunks of time when we rest in space. It even means small things like not reaching for my cell phone when there's a spare moment. It means not playing music in the car, not turning on background noise. We don't leave a lot of space for our souls. And we need to. So where are the spaces throughout your day that you could let your soul just be in silence? The practices of silence and solitude and stillness are so necessary for our souls to be at rest. In that space, we can do what I said in that quote. We can see more clearly. We can know who is God. And spoiler alert, it's not us, right? It's a time when we can have our perspective restored. We need space for our souls to breathe, space to recognize the presence of God, space for him to speak, and space to respond. Jesus said, "Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life." So how are you getting away with God in that space? Mother Teresa said, "We need to find God, and he cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence. See how nature, trees, flowers, grass grow in silence. See how the stars, the moon, and the sun, how they move in silence." We need silence to be able to touch souls. And we see this pattern in Jesus. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus often went out into a quiet, lonely, desolate place to be with the Lord. It was his habit. And in Matthew 11:29, Jesus says, "Watch how I do it." He's not telling us to do something he's not doing. He shows us what it looks like to rest. And I would suggest that Jesus didn't just go to pray because he had a lot of stuff going on that day and he wanted to make sure that God was on board with it. It wasn't a work meeting to prep for the day. It was communion. It was restorative for his soul to be with the Lord. It was getting into the right mental, emotional, spiritual space to live the life that God had called him to. It was seeing himself rightly. Jesus practiced humility and trust. The desire and the need for rest are human, but the practice of it is divine. It is a divine example given to us. God demonstrated it to us in the very beginning. God didn't rest on the seventh day because he was tired. He rested because he wanted to enjoy, to see his creation, to be part of it, to be present with it. And Jesus too models it for us, models rest, models Sabbath. We are to imitate his patterns. And the second thing that we do is we rest in grace. In times of Sabbath, we become aware of the demands that we are putting on our souls. And maybe you've done this. You've decided you're going to take some time to yourself and you sit down and you're like, okay, I'm going to read this book. I'm going to just sit and enjoy the outdoors or something. And all you can think about is everything that's not getting done right now and how it's all going to catch up to you in the end. And you feel guilty and selfish, and it ends up being not restful at all. We are not very good at being kind to ourselves, at being gracious with ourselves. There's a great song by Andrew Peterson called "Be Kind to Yourself." I would encourage you to listen to it after the sermon, not now. But in it he says, when does it end when this war that you're in is just you against you against you? That's what we do. We berate ourselves. We get down on ourselves. We're hard on ourselves. We put pressure on ourselves to do more and be more and have more. God's voice is never demanding. It never judges. It never condemns. So if that's the voice in your head, that is not God, and it is not a voice worth listening to. Remember what Jesus says, "Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life." Verse, he doesn't have verses in the message. The end of the passage says, "Walk with me, work with me, keep company with me." When we get away with who God is, everything falls into place. We see ourselves rightly. We see his power and truth and grace to carry us through what wearies us. We find grace to help us do what he's called us to do. So his grace is like a rock in the midst of a busy storm. We have to form a habit of saying at times, there's more to do. I am not done, but I'm going to rest here for a minute in my soul. I'm going to listen to his voice, speak words that heal and restore and quiet me. Maybe you can't get time away from your responsibilities, but you can always speak to yourself in a way that allows your soul to be at rest in the midst of a storm. You can be conscious of the truth that you're taking in. You can be conscious of the way that you're speaking to yourself and speak kindness and grace and gentleness, because that is how God speaks to you. You can agree with him about what he says about who you are. What we're doing is what Jesus says in verse 30. He says, learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I love that phrase. And if there's anything you walk away with today, I would hope it would be that. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. When we have a pattern of resting in our lives, we can listen to God. We can hear from him. We can respond to his Spirit, leading us to unforced rhythms of work and rest, work and rest. We can learn to speak grace to ourselves in agreement with him. We rest because we are human, and we rest because we are free. Are we approaching rest with humility and trust? How will you make times of rest part of the rhythm of your life? Are you speaking grace and gentleness and kindness that allows your soul to come in from the storm and rest in a solid place? Jesus' life was full, but he was not hurried. He did just what God called him to do and no more, no less. He practiced Sabbath, both as a time and as an attitude, and he invites us to do the same. You should pray with me. God, we thank you so much that we live in relationship with you, who love us and are gracious to us, and we thank you for this invitation to rest. God, we want to honor you in how we live, that we would not be driven by our own egos or our own needs, but we would live in step with you. God, would you show each of us what that looks like to live in step with you and to experience those unforced rhythms of grace. In Jesus' name, amen.